in the room also do. And then you like to think about how to get a higher wage. As a co-founder WageIndicator, I started working on minimum wage, living wage as well. Once you have a living wage, of course, it's crazy that there is not a living wage for self-employed or for freelancers or for gig workers. So that's why we have them. If you have them for one group, you need to have them for all. At this moment, as WageIndicator, we deliver living wages for those who have a job, for those who have or a job and a boss, for those who have a job but no boss, so do it themselves, self-employed, and for those who work together as small farmers. So there's 3 types of living wage, living income, living tariff.
And Paulien, is there also a difference in discussion on pay floors for gig workers also compared to the traditional labor market?
Well, fundamentally not, because the biggest problem, of course, is that as soon as you have a boss and as soon as there is a collective agreement, it makes it a bit easier to get for a big group of employees or workers a reasonable salary level. If you have to do your own negotiations, as you have to do as self-employed, but also as gig workers, it's more difficult. And so it's part of it. You have to negotiate yourself, which means you need to create power as a group of freelancers. And what we fundamentally do at this moment with setting the discussion on living tariff is say, come, be aware that you deserve a living tariff, and let's step by step see how can we make it happen. For sure, for a rider, taxi driver, someone who's working as a translator from maybe P&G, obviously it's very difficult, because then your employer is a kind of let's say platform, and to talk with negotiate with a platform is maybe more difficult even than to negotiate with the person from whom you clean the house. So therefore, an extra reason to discuss and to get the awareness. What is a minimum wage? What is a living wage? And what is a living tariff? Because freelancers need to take care for their own pension, their own social security, etc.
Yeah, so it's also about creating transparency within the price setting and make people aware of how their cost is being built, and in the end what they then should also earn per hour to in the end also come to a living wage, right?
Well, to a living income, to a living tariff, because let's say a living wage, and Danny will explain a bit more about it, but a living wage is of course still when you have an employer. Mm-hmm. But self-employed or gig workers, they don't have an employer. They do their gig, and therefore they need to make sure that they get enough money for that hour they work or that week they work. So it's a different concept, and it's good to know what is part of it. How should you survive?
Yeah, okay. And in the end, if you look at the pay floors, they're mostly institutionalized for employed workers. We're now going to talk about the pay floors for self-employed workers, so workers that don't have an employer, where the risk and costs are on the shoulders of the individual worker. You have lots of experience on the living wage and implementing living wage, and it's also a concept that evolves over time. What do you think are the key points that contribute to the success of living wage, which we can also use in the discussion of setting a pay floor for self-employed workers?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, try to make sure that people are very precise on the contract type. You talk about a living wage or you talk about a living tariff. At this moment, in many places in the world, people say, hey, clap, 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 very good. Someone gets a living wage. And then we say, what is that someone doing? And then apparently it was just a self-employed person, which means that person gets 40% less than that person should get, because it could not take care for their own social security. But still that big firm says, hey, it was well done, because there is not enough knowledge about it. not in the trade unions, I would say, not at the employer side, but also not in NGO side. So step by step to make sure that self-employed people, half of the world, are working population in the world, that they also need a proper income. That is time to do that now. What you can learn from the discussion related to living wages, which is a discussion which is there already for 12 years, and so it's not very, very new. Each time, make sure you understand the minimum wage, legal minimum wage in the country. Minimum wage applies for let's say people with a boss, so wage workers, but not for self-employed in most of the countries. Still, it's good to understand what is the minimum wage. On that top, you understand what is living wage, and then on top of that, you understand the living tariff. The whole process takes long. And it's so long, 10 years, many times, discuss about it and try not to trap in the discussion of which method is the best, or your food basket should be €1 higher or so, because these are really details. And it's about the principle that when you're a freelancer, that you also need to have a social security when you have no work, are really unemployed, or when you're as a pensioner. So you need to be treated as fair as an employee, actually. That concept, you need to talk and talk and talk about it each time. And we need to be very precise in the definitions as well. And then just not giving up. All the time, not giving up, not accepting if someone says, it's a living wage. It's anyway for someone who's precarious or informal. Informal people are people, precarious people are people. And we all are now and then precarious. So these wordings are very negative for self-employed, or let's say proud people, as we are being self-employed.
Yeah, and we are also both self-employed, so we also
and it's
know the discussion in that. Yeah.
So it's crucial that as self-employed, you're not less than someone who's employed. To turn it different, you don't want to be employed. You want to be self-employed.
The voice of the worker in the debate is many times also not there. So also summarize. So you also say, okay, so it's about knowledge, building knowledge, and keep on explaining. Also the difference. What you also let's see now with the ILO platform convention, there's being talked about the living wage. But as you also shared, that applies to employed workers, not to self-employed workers. It's about time and being patient, but also really be really precise in any definitions that you communicate. And that's also one of my last questions. So how do you, because you also already mentioned, so it will never be perfect. So how do you also deal in the discussion with all the stakeholders about this imperfection of pay floors? Because the living wage is not perfect, but if you look to self-employed, it will be never perfect, because there are so many variables where you can discuss about that you can just drown in a discussion, and in the end nothing happens. So how do you deal also with stakeholders in the debates around this imperfection?
Thank you. Let's say one side, definitions are important, because otherwise you don't get anywhere. And then people say, these precarious, they don't need a living wage, they don't need a living tariff. What a nonsense. So definitions are crucial, I would say. But on the other side, the knowledge that a living wage will not be paid by all companies in the world, not even by 2030, is understood. Also because living wage is fluctuating. So take your time and accept that companies say we work towards a living wage, and sometimes in 99% of their locations, everybody has a living wage, but maybe next year in 98% or so. So they work towards a living wage. Same for living tariff, except each improvement there is, that's better than to nail everybody down who has not paid perfectly the living tariff, which Dani calculated for this month. Because so be freaky on that doesn't help. So definitions important, and working towards also important.
Yeah, so that also really ask the balance between nice in theory, but also how to bring it into practice, and just find this right balance. Be flexible and also realistic, but also be sharp, because
but I would say
in the platforms.
as the discussion on living wages, I would say we at this moment we pretty far in that the living wages as we present them quarter on quarter and in October for the whole year, they are accepted and they are taken very serious. And auditors come knock on the door of these companies and say, "Did you pay these estimates from Wage Indicator?" And then they say, "Yes, almost." So that really works. So for Living Tariff, good hope that it will help. We
Good.
get there.
Good to hear. It's always nice to have hope, right? So when you're developing new tools and everything, which is, and also when you can also link it to something that exists, where you can also relate to. I think it's also really helps. And then the last question. So today we're going to talk about pay floors for self-employed gig workers. So what do you think is also the maybe your most important thing to consider within the discussion today?
What I hope that everybody who gets out of the room end of the day says, Wage Indicator now has a living wage, but also a living tariff. So a living wage for an employee, a living tariff for self-employed. On top of that living tariff, we can present for a set of occupations which are, let's say, which you see more like cleaners, translators, writers. We can also present a living tariff for that group. So that is on top occupational related items, I would say. But each time there is a basic and focus on the basic first. The basic living tariff needs to be okay. And it's 40% higher than the living wage.
Yeah. Okay.
Depending on
Perfect.
the country.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution, Paulien.
Good luck.
Thank you. And also rated also two questions in the chat by Isabella that not all self-employed want to be independent. I think it's also a nice bridge to the next two speakers about the question, about the choice of being a freelancer or not, or being forced or framed by a platform as the partner of the platform. It's always interesting to also be really critical on the wording people are using. So we're now going to the first round, and I want to ask Susanne Muscat from the ITUC. She works as a legal officer at the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, which is a global organization which represents 191 million workers in 169 countries and territories, which is enormously. So also welcome here, Susanne.
Hello, I'm very happy to be here.
Good. We're happy for you to be that you're here. So I also have some questions for you. So can you maybe first give us some context on the complexity of the discussion on fair pay for self-employed workers in a world that is designed for employed workers?
So I think I will answer this question very much from the trade union perspective, from the perspective of the organizations that are there to organize workers to collectively defend their rights. So what we see as a big problem, one of the main reasons why the pays are so low for many categories of non-standard workers, including gig workers, all those who do not have employment contracts and are not covered by labor laws, is the fact that these workers are not entitled to their collective rights. So we have concrete legal exclusions. Self-employed workers are characterized as one businesses, especially if they are VAT payers. Then they are entrepreneurs under the law and businesses, not humans sort of anymore. So they are forbidden in many jurisdictions to join the unions, and definitely the unions will have major legal problems to negotiate, especially wage agreements on behalf of these non-standard workers, and especially the one solo businesses or gig providers, whatever we call the workers. And this is because we have still this well identified by persistent conflict between worker protection and competition protection. So we have very strong competition laws that prohibit specifically agreements that distort the market. So they are there to protect competition, to protect good prices for consumers. And they prohibit agreements that set up minimum prices or minimum wages. So we see this, like an agreement like that, especially if made by the group of workers, be that represented by the trade unions or just a group of workers, this will be a price cartel, wage cartel in this case. And we have already case law like that. Both parties, we can have a good company that wants to sign a collective agreement that will give, like the protection, minimum protection of rates, like minimum rates to their platform workers. And then both the group of workers or a trade union and this ethical company will be fined by the National Competition Authority. So we have this major problem still largely unresolved. And we as trade unions, we will say this is one of the major reasons for low earnings of gig workers.
Yeah. So what you say is so because they also have are kind of blocked by competition protection. That really prevents a good discussion on this minimum rates discussions. And if you look at so trade unions who are affiliated to the ITUC are also among the stakeholders in the ILO Platform Work Convention discussion. Can you tell us what the potential impact of this convention is and what the standpoints on pay topic are from the ITUC perspective and the members?
So International Labour Organization is a very interesting organization, the only one where non-government actors have full negotiation rights in a standard setting. So not only the governments, also workers and employers organizations. We do negotiate right now an instrument that is supposed to provide minimum labor standards for platform workers. The title is Decent Working Platform Economy. And actually we are really dealing with this foundational problem. Do platform workers have fundamental labor and human rights? Or simply by the type of contract they are excluded from the access to their labor and human rights. And it's not only collective rights. We also have a right to fair pay that allows decent living for everyone and the member of the family, and for non-discrimination in this regard. This is the fundamental human right contained in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. The covenant says everyone, non-discrimination, regardless of the basis. Definitely, we would say not the type of the employment contract. But what we see from like a major backlash is with the argument, again, that the self-employed workers are not workers. Platforms are not employers. This is purely business to business relationship. Even if we have a human on the one side and the multi-billion corporation on the other side, this is business to business. This is purely commercial matter. And this relationship has to be governed by the fundamental principle of the freedom of contract. So I, as a platform worker, I should be fully free to contract myself out regardless of how low the conditions are. And there should be no any protective interference by, for instance, labor rules or human rights. So that's how this relationship is understood. Specifically on the wage issues, we have matters, and I must stress that this is still subject to the negotiations. So no one can say what the outcome will be next year in June. But what we have, at least in a draft text, is protective measures such as compensation for costs incurred during work. So that could be, for instance, fuel, internet costs, like basically workers in employment relationships should be compensated for the cost they incur when they carry out the work. Compensation for unpaid labor. I know that Professor Valeria wrote extensively on this topic, so maybe this will come back. Deductions. So we have lots of untransparent deductions made by the platforms. What we have now in text is that at least these deductions should be clearly regulated in law. And the last thing would be that workers should be able to decline a task or disconnect from the platform without retaliation, obviously including any retaliation through deductions, lower payment and so on. So I think in a nutshell, that would be it.
Yes, very interesting. Thanks also for your answer on that. And I think it is also always the question. So is it about workers versus platform workers, or is it more about the freelancers where what you also addressed within your first answer, don't have access to these collective rights, but also in the employment contract, whereas also all other benefits of the worker are being linked, like occupational health and safety, which are more and more really linked to the employment contracts instead of just being as the to the worker. And so you already mentioned it's a bit, but maybe good to address it a bit more. So the discussions on pay in the Platform Work Convention. So what do you think are the main foundational challenges? And you already mentioned some things in that, like the lack of the collective rights for freelancers. Maybe also the discussion on bogus employment or self-employment, of course. So how do you look to that?
So indeed, misclassification or a correct classification is a major challenge. And it's true that we have in some countries, we already have extension of collective rights, including pay negotiations to certain categories of freelancers or certain categories of workers who do not have labor contracts. We have attempts to invent a third category of worker, which sometimes will be applicable to platform workers or gig workers, such as dependent contractors. So we see workers that are classified not as employees with full labor protection, and as much as if their relationship looks like a labor relationship, they case by case could have their collective rights extended, and for instance, trade unions could negotiate on their behalf. But these would be mostly non-employees who in fact resemble employees almost fully. So it's rather the question why they do not have fully protected labor contracts, right? Or the types of freelance contracts in certain sectors where providers want to enjoy more flexibility, but still the contracts that bring flexibility not on the expense of protection. So I think this is a big problem, and obviously another problem is algorithmic management and the fact that especially maybe all of us in near future will be more or less, managed by algorithms. The problem is that these algorithms are treated as a secret, as property of a company. And what we learned about the algorithms used by some platforms was in litigation. It was extremely difficult to have discovery on the details how the algorithms operate. So we need to somehow also regulate that transparency and certain minimum standards when it comes to being governed by an algorithm. This is definitely the discussion of the future.
Yeah, thanks. So what you also say that in the end, good working conditions are not a trade-off for flexibility, which is in many cases framed like this, and about the algorithm management that there also need to be more transparency and accountability. And I think there are also quite some opportunities because many data laws like the European GDPR, they don't look are you employed or not. They just look to the individual person. There's also a nice research project. I think it's in Belgium. I don't know. It's called GD Power. So GDPR and then power in between. Academics are always really creative in creating names for their projects, where they also look, okay, how can we do so how can we use GDPR also to in the end get these kind of transparency and accountability within this technology, which I think pretty interesting for that. Okay, Susanne, thank you very much for your contribution. I'll come back to you at the end of the webinar for one last question. But for now, thank you very much for sharing your insight from the ITUC perspective. And then I want to go to the next speaker, Leena. She's a senior researcher on poverty and inequality at Human Rights Watch, where she investigates how economic, fiscal, and social policies affect human rights, especially in relation to social protection in the changing world of work. Her recent work examines platform labor, wage insecurity, and technology's impact on workers' rights. So, Leena, welcome to this online environment, and great that you are able to participate.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Good to hear. And I also wrote quite some of your work. It's always nice to see all the different perspectives. And one part of your work is also, of course, in the end, also engaging with the workers themselves, because in many discussions we are talking about workers, but yeah, the voice of the worker is in many discussions not there. Also, so many research on workers in the gig economy you did on different continents. So what are the main issues around pay that you heard in your conversations with the workers that you talked to?
So one of the and maybe I should clarify, sort of, when we do our research so far at Human Rights Watch on gig workers or platform workers has focused primarily on location-based platform work. So you can think of sort of rideshare, food delivery, grocery shopping, that type of activity, because there's of course a great variety in the types of gig and platform work that people are engaged in. And we released a study that we worked on for a couple of years that looked at the United States, specifically at the state of Texas, which has some of the weakest labor laws in the country. And this is why we were interested to see what the situation of platform work is there. But then we've also done some work in other countries, including in Mexico, a couple of EU countries, Georgia, and some other places. And I think some of the messages that we've really heard from workers across places are at least four. So the first one being that wages are generally very low and often quite unpredictable. So often before accepting a task or an order, people wouldn't know how much they would be paid. And pay can be fluctuating enormously from one week to the other. And often what we heard is that once people start on a certain app or platform, they receive relatively well pay, but then over a month and years that they work for a given company, the pay can drop and almost be cut by half. And we also then try to find out more concretely how much people earn, which isn't an easy task given the complete lack of transparency. And often also the lack of knowledge that people have of how much they're getting paid by the hour due to the waiting time that goes uncompensated and being paid for a task rather than by time. But after deducting all kinds of calculations, we arrived that people get a take-home pay of about $5.12 an hour. So that is about 30% below what is the federal minimum wage in the United States, and 70% below what is considered to be a living wage in the state of Texas. The second item that we heard goes back to what I already touched on, which is the unpaid waiting time. So that sometimes workers spend as much as 30 to 40% of their day waiting between orders. And this is certainly work time and not leisure, because people are sitting in their cars waiting for the next customer or the order to arrive. The third item that we heard is the cost shifting that occurs, meaning that people have to pay for all the work-related expenses, and they generally have to pay them upfront. We heard from workers, for instance, that they start the month really in the negative, and then have to work many days and sometimes weeks even to break even. And after that point, they starting to actually sort of make an earning, or make a living. But all of that, again, depends on how many orders are coming in, how much pay they receive. There's sometimes days or weeks where people are not essentially making any money, or sort of at least earning on that side. And in our analysis, we found that in Texas, at least, as much as 70% of what people make goes to expenses, right? And so that goes to things like car payments, gas, insurance costs, but also we calculated in Social Security expenses or healthcare. And then the last item is around what Susanna already touched on, the issue around algorithmic management, and sort of this issue of being managed by an algorithm and sort of these automated decision-making processes that really have so little transparency, so that you are being constantly monitored and judged by an algorithm where, that then determines the wage that you receive, and sort of, creates this complete lack of transparency about your working situation. And maybe to cite, I think, a really interesting work by Professor Veena Dubal that talks about algorithmic wage discrimination, that shows how many of these systems can also replicate racial, gender, and geographic bias in their decision-making processes.
Yes, thanks. I think it's also good also to mention the last. And I think also, just thinking out loud, that's maybe because we're always talking about algorithmic management, and a nice word for somebody that stutters. But in the end, maybe we're also using the wrong word for that, because in the end, it is management by humans, but then executed via a algorithm. Because when you say algorithm management, then you can say, okay, yeah, blame technology. But in the end, it's of course blame the humans that design and control the algorithm. So maybe it's also interesting for another discussion to see how we can also maybe reframe this word into different words to also get a good discussion on that. And what also came in the discussion with Susanna before you was also about the difference between being employed and being self-employed. And in the article, UN panel discusses need for stronger protections for platform workers. You also mentioned extend wage protections, social security, and workplace safety protections to platform workers. Do you then also maybe suggest that there should be a more contract neutral or independent system? And how do you also look from a more global perspective, knowing that also the employment model is in many places in the world not the dominant construct?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as Susanna already said earlier, if you look at international human rights law and standards, it's very clear that these protections should apply to all workers, right, regardless of whether they're classified as employees or self-employed. But in our work, we're very clear that at least in the areas of platform work that we analyzed, misclassification is systemic, and workers rarely are in situations of genuine independence. And in fact, we see that platforms really control every aspect of their work. No, they control wages, they control assignments, evaluations, ratings, they discipline workers, all of which are functions of an employer. But then they classify workers as independent contractors to avoid certain employer obligations.
Yeah.
And there have been some governments that try to fix this. No, in the United States, for instance, California is sort of a well-known case where there was an attempt to introduce an ABC test with sort of very clear criteria to determine whether a worker is truly independent, and companies mounted a multi-million-dollar campaign and legally challenged the decision to avoid this reclassification. And I think what this tells us is that these fights will continue, and therefore misclassification will likely stay with us, which is why we think it's really important that the convention covers all workers, right? So it covers employees, of course, but it also covers platform workers classified as self-employed.
Yeah, and you also mentioned the AB5 campaign where you had multi-million campaign. I think it was about 200 million. So it was multi-million campaign.
Yes.
There were some stakes over there. Yes, interesting. So and also because you and Human Rights Watch, you're also involved within the discussion with the ILO Platform Work Convention. So what are your observations on the discussions on pay for self-employed workers in the discussions where you're also part of?
Yeah, and we actually published a submission commenting on the first draft of the convention today. But I think, and Susanna already mentioned a couple of the details, so I'm not going to repeat those. But I think what's been really interesting in the negotiations so far is on both items, the sort of the classification question, or what is the definition of a worker, as well as when it comes to fair pay, is this continued debate around what is the obligation of the company, right? So when it comes to pay, even the debate around the terminology, right? So should it be payment that is cited in the convention, or should it be remuneration? And these seem like, sort of very technical or sort of specific debates, but they go to the crux of the issue, right? Of how far companies want to admit the activity of the workers they're engaged in, and also therefore the obligations that companies should have as employers. And so, around pay, of course, the debate around should costs be reimbursed, should waiting time be compensated, what about bonuses, what about tips, should they be incorporated? So all of that is still being negotiated, and I think it's really important to pay attention to it, as it could, in countries that later ratify the convention, make a dramatic difference in domestic law.
Yes, interesting to hear, and also to make a bridge to the next topic, and also to explore the question on impacts, and maybe also the question, why should we care about this? It's also interesting to see what happened in New York, where they set the minimum pay for app-based restaurant and delivery workers. Can you maybe shortly describe what happened there, and also what the effects were on the workers?
Yeah. I think New York is a really fascinating and very inspiring case, as it all started with workers organizing themselves, which was, I think it started sort of truly during the pandemic, where workers, mainly app-based delivery workers, started their own research about their pay conditions and ran a survey, and then presented the findings to the city council, which then issued their own study and found extremely low pay across the board. which then in turn led to the city creating a minimum pay standard, which was introduced in 2023, and now this year reached $21 an hour before tips and indexed to inflation. And this is sort of the understanding that the minimum pay standard for platform workers needs to be set higher than for employees, given the extra expenses that people have, right? So once you deduct all of that, the assumption is that you reach a similar minimum wage to employees, which is currently, I think, around $15 an hour. And the impact is quite significant, right? I think many workers saw their pay double. Now people see waiting time also being recognized as working time. And this affects over 60,000 workers in the city. No, so it's a really big market for this type of work. It has made a tremendous difference.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that. And I think also nice for the rich next speaker, Valeria Pugliano, about the unpaid labor. I also read in one of the reports that the department study project that the minimum rate will encourage apps to use workers' time more efficiently, increasing deliveries from 1.6 to 2.5 per hour. So also shifting the responsibility of no work to the platform, in the end also forces the platform to also think about this efficiency, because in the end, then they pay the bill for that. So I think it's also interesting to look at. So thank you very much, Leena, for your contribution and your work.
Thank you.
So, and then we're going to the second round about the question about how to calculate the living pay. And first speaker is Valeria Pugliano. She's professor of sociology at the Center of Sociological Research at KU Leuven. She's the PI of the ERC Events Grant Respect Me project, where she studies forms of unpaid labor in the platform economy, creative industries and care, and how these account for and develop a measurement of precarious work. The ERC is now finished, as I understand, right, Valeria? But with you, I really want to discuss the discussion on unpaid labor for self-employed workers. So first, welcome here, Valeria. Good to have you back.
Yeah, nice to see you all. Thank you very much for inviting me and having this conversation all together. Well, one thing first, Respect Me closed, but basically we started a follow-up, a new ERC, where we will be trying to relate unpaid labor to macro-level indicators, so minimum wages, collective bargaining, and welfare system. So hopefully we will be able to discover a bit more about the hidden side of unpaid labor, particularly within the European context. So thank you for having me here. And so regarding unpaid labor, so if I understood well, you want me to kind of sketch a bit about the history of unpaid labor, or?
Yeah. Maybe the first question. So can you give a bit more context on the unpaid labor in a more historical context? Because in the end, unpaid labor was always there. So can you sketch it a bit more, the context?
Yes, no, you are absolutely right. I mean, unpaid labor is not something that is new. Unpaid labor in paid employment is something that historically always existed, and normally now, without going too much, back into history, but we all know that, particularly in legal studies, institutional theories, people have started to talk about wage theft. And wage theft, in fact, is, if you like, the kind of linkage to what we understand as being unpaid labor in paid employment, because, of course, unpaid labor outside the labor market, that's something different. That's social reproductive labor, of course, which is also something that I think we should discuss perhaps at some point and link it to paid labor on paid labor in paid employment, but that probably would be for another occasion. So what is this wage theft? Well, basically the way in which let's say, studies have been defining and looking at wage theft is from the side of the violation or denial of legally or contractually owned remuneration to workers by employers. So within the realm, in fact, of an employment relationship, and this links very much into what also Susanna was previously saying. Now, wage theft, of course, encompasses a wide range of different practices. process through which, in fact, workers are normally seen as deprived of these, income that normally they should earn according to labor law, or also according to agreed terms and conditions, particularly collective agreements. And, in that sense, I think also that if we look back into history and not so far ago, we see that this kind of wage theft has been also linked to the way in which, let's say, labor markets have been fragmented, and the way in which corporate organizations have been restructuring and reorganizing themselves, particularly within, I would say, supply chain. Now, for example, there is an interesting, in fact, study and book done by David Wells in 2014 on the fissured workplaces, where, in fact, he argues about the rise of subcontracting, franchising, and perhaps we could hear also why not had nowadays the platform work in current times, which in fact, what all these kind of changes and restructuring, reorganizing in labor market have been doing, they've been basically diffusing, if you like, the kind of capacity of employers to kind of detach themselves from the kind of responsibility that normally they should have within the realm of the employment relationship. And therefore, kind of making enforcement of wage standards more difficult, and enabling in that sense, the kind of increase of wage theft as, I would argue, a systemic outcome rather than an isolated sort of misconduct. Now, of course, we see different forms through which wage theft takes place. Here, I'm not going to go much more in details, but particularly one important, which actually I think we should remind, because we had a recent decision of the European Court of Justice on minimum wages. Now, minimum wages, normally the underpayment below statutory minimum wages, is one of the forms through which wage theft occurred. So we should be happy that, we reached at least with the results that we see now, and which were, in fact, delivered by the European Court of Justice. Another important form, I would say, very close to what has been discussed before by Susanne and also Leena, mentioning the misclassification of workers. This is another thing through which wage theft, in fact, takes place. But there are also many other forms which are related particularly to time, the dimension of time that I would like to stress here. So the non-payment of wages, so the so-called unpaid overtime, but also I would say the off-the-clock work, as normally is called, the unpaid trial shifts, or also the late payments that normally employers also used to enforce. Now, there is, aside this more kind of, if you like, institutional legal definition about the different forms of wage theft, of course, sociology has been also contributing a lot to this debate, and has been kind of, according to me, also setting a new, I would say, floor for understanding this idea of wage theft, from where it comes from, or at least what are the processes through which also wage theft occurs and still occurs in our labor market. And here we could think about structural coercion, for example, the fact that particularly in situation of precarious, low wage or undercommanded position, normally here workers are afraid to report on their own violation for being, kind of then they actually feel the fear to be kind of retaliated from the employer's side. Normalization and invisibility also wage theft is quite important. So the way in which wage theft is normalized, and the way in which unpaid labor, we find it quite a lot in our study, is normalized through the fact that, this is part of the job. So there are practices, there are things, there are unpaid waiting time, for example, which are not conceived just as such, because these are seen as part of the job. And of course, here a lot of unpaid labor occurs. So, we see a lot of these kind of things happening. And what this produces at the end is these kind of symptoms of the degradation of labor standards under new conditions, neoliberal governance, flexible labor regimes, which in fact, of course, deliver what we see nowadays in terms of, bad working conditions for workers.
And if you look to unpaid labor in the gig economy, we already had quite some example also from the previous speakers. But do you also, so So we also discussed, okay, it's not only about time. So unpaid labor is also maybe also the occupation related time and cost. So can you maybe elaborate a bit more on what kind of unpaid labor, especially focusing on the platform or gig economy, are we talking about besides the already mentioned examples like the waiting time, but also the time to go from your home to the place where you start your work? Yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely. A lot of these relates also to what has been already discussed. But if we want to make a kind of summary, well, first of all, yes, I think that the gig economy produces some kind of distinctive forms of unpaid labor that we have to kind of investigate and study. And why is that? Because, in fact, the way in which platforms organize work, value work, govern work through, in fact, algorithm, as has been said before, creates some distinctivenesses in the way in which then, of course, unpaid labor kind of unfolds from platform work. Well, first, I would say the platform frequently shifts labor time that in fact would traditionally be paid by the employers, but this now is shifted as a risk on the workers themselves. And as also has been indicated by Leena before, talking about this waiting time, but there is also a lot of this time spent searching for tasks. Of course, as we said, waiting, also kind of coordinating across different tasks and jobs, traveling, as you said, Martin, but also, kind of managing, for example, the kind of technology that these workers are faced when they work through platforms, ratings, customer communication and satisfaction. So all these kind of things, and all these translates at the end into what normally we call work extensification. So working longer hours. Now, here I want to also make a little point, because I'm also very sensitive vis-a-vis this freelancers issue, because I see, in fact, that freelancers normally are conceived as a particular group, which has always been working unpaid. Now, like as the normal freelancers, normal self-employed. But actually, what we see nowadays through platforms is that the unpaid labor that they normally should perform creates more, it's a bit more than what, and creates a lot of problems to them, because they, at the end, they don't have a return on investment that they used to have when they didn't do this kind of services and jobs through the platforms. So at the end of the day, the competition issue that, in fact, Susanna was also mentioning, we see it very much disrupted by these platforms, particularly for these real freelancers that have to kind of work through platforms. Now, so at the end of the day, what we see here is that at the core of the creation of this unpaid labor in different forms through platforms, we see, in fact, the way in which platforms organize work. We see also the way in which, let's say, the classification of the workers themselves is done. These people are, conceived being self-employed. And here, particularly, I'm looking at the on-location gig work. But de facto, these workers are under the control of the platforms, under the control of the technology. So this misclassification, of course, is another way through which we see the distinctivenesses of the unpaid labor produced through platforms. And of course, the algorithm management, as I mentioned before. Another thing I want to say now, linking it to the point of the kind of discrimination issue, which was also mentioned previously. Of course, this unpaid labor is not, evenly distributed. It's unevenly distributed through platforms, because in fact, if we compare, for example, care domestic platforms in comparison to, food delivery or even real freelancers through platforms, we see a lot of differences in here. And why I say this, because, for example, the care domestic platforms, we see a lot of unpaid, which is, of course, performed through traditional forms, which is, emotional labor, relational labor, but we also see a kind of new forms in terms of, for example, harassment elements, which used not to be there when people were talking about socially reproductive labor, at least not in the same way in which now care and domestic platforms tend to, produce these forms of unpaid labor as well. And of course, dramatic consequences for workers as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. And what I also realized is that normally with real freelancer, in the end, also unpaid labor is also, could you also maybe frame a bit like opportunity costs, so that you also build on your business. But when you're dependent on the platform for your new gig, you keep on being dependent on that. So that's also, that investment in time doesn't pay out in future assignments for that. So thank you very much, Valeria, for your insight and sharing it. It was really valuable, and I think also a really beautiful bridge to our next speaker, Daniela Ceccon. She's the Director of Data of the WageIndicator Foundation and also involved in the development of the Living Tariff and the enormous database behind. So Dani, welcome here
Thank you.
at Zoom. So there was already quite some discussion about the unpaid labor, about the different variables which you could include within a tariff for self-employed platform workers or not. So we're going to talk about the Living Tariff. Paulien already taught a bit about it, but can you tell us more about the Living Tariff? So where does the idea come from, and also how does the methodology works?
Yeah, as you probably all know now, WageIndicator calculates the living wage. We started in 2014 with that, and the living wage is basically how much a person should earn to be able to lead a decent life in the location where they work. It's of course based on the cost of living. So at WageIndicator, we do data collection on the cost of living globally. We have a living wage for 182 countries and 4,000 regions at the moment. And this living wage is a combination of components. So there's housing, so it's basic components. There's housing, food, transport, healthcare, taxes, and so on. But of course, as Paulien was explaining, so the living wage is based on some assumptions. Well, one of which is that the person is employed, so that the person is an employee, that the employer usually pays for job-related costs, that the employee works a certain number of hours, which is agreed and defined, and it's paid. He or she is paid for those hours. And also that the employer pays all the social security contributions that are due according to the law, right? But then we asked ourselves, what about self-employed? They're also workers, they also get paid, they have a job. So, but the living wage cannot apply to them because all these assumptions normally don't apply to them. So we decided to create a tool which is based on the living wage. And it's also, so because it's based on the living wage, it's also based on the region of the user. And then is also using based on the job that the person is doing for different types of platforms. So this tool basically tries to tackle some of the issues that the other speakers discussed or mentioned earlier. And it's built on different layers. So we start from the net living wage, which comes from our data collection and calculations. What is interesting is that we calculate that assuming that this self-employed person will work the same working hours that a normal employee would work in that country, and that this person would have the same days of leave, so paid leave and festive days as an employee. And this is all based on the labor law database, which is another one of the many databases that we maintain, where we collect labor law information from the different countries. But next to that, we include some additional costs, of course. So there are work-related costs, so equipment, which is also based on our data collection, because in our cost of living survey, we also collect this type of information. So cost of a laptop, cost of fuel, and so on. So depending on the job, there are different work-related costs that are applied. And then there is what we just discussed, the work-related overhead time, which is time that can be spent on administration, acquisition, communication, training, waiting time, very important. So all these things are calculated from time, so from minutes, which we defined on the basis of desk research that we did. They are transformed into money, and this money goes into this hourly living tariff. And then, of course, we have the taxes and social security part, which is different from the living wage because we include also all that part of social security, which usually would be paid by the employer. So in addition to the living wage, we also have that additional social security part. So the result is basically an hourly tariff that covers all these costs.
And so there are quite some uncertainties and variables, especially because also within the occupation rated equipment and overhead time cost. So can you also tell us how we should interpret these numbers and how do you balance between the general and the individual needs and variables of the workers?
Yeah, so this is, I think, the first feedback that we got when we made the first version of the tool. Because, well, as I said, we, depending on the job, we assign a certain equipment, but that's of course based on like general assumptions. So I don't know if you are a self-employed and who does office work, then we assume the laptop, internet, and so on. And that is the same for all the countries and just dependent on the job. And then for the time, as I said, we spoke to gig workers, when we had all these discussions, and we came up with a certain number of minutes per activity. But of course, the feedback we got, and we also know that these can vary depending on the country, the platform you work for. Just people may need for their job a different type of equipment, or the worker may realize that they actually spent more time on some activities. So that's why the tool has a next section where we allow for customization. So the user can change, the number of days of leave that they want to have during the year, for example, but also the time that they spend on different activities. They can add equipment, and the tool basically computes a new living tariff at that point.
Yeah, so you can really customize based on your variables. Let's say you're a taxi driver and you have a really expensive car, then you can put the number up and then it will calculate in the end. So what should you then ask more per hour to in the end being able to cover those costs? And then my last question, so for who is a living tariff? Is it for workers, unions, platforms, policymakers, scientists? So for who is it?
Yeah, so we got this question often because it's true that if you say this is only for platform workers, for example, then one could say, yes, nice, but it's not the worker who decides the tariff, it's the platform, right? So we say that, yes, first, it's a tool for platform workers, but also self-employed. By the way, we know that many self-employed can actually bargain their rates. So this could be really a nice tool for them to be able to calculate how much they should ask per hour. But of course, next to that, we feel that this tool can really be a valid system for platforms and companies to check if they're paying fair tariffs. Okay, I know we are talking about the fact that platforms don't care, but as Paulien was explaining, we work with many companies who want to pay living wages or who are planning to pay living wages. So why not platforms, I would say. Then, of course, unions. We have quite some experience with unions using our tool, especially, for example, in Indonesia. Because they can use it to bargain better rates. So in collective agreements for platform workers, for example, but in general to, ask for fairer wages for their group. So it could be also a union of, I don't know, riders or something. And then policymakers as well could use the tool, because the issue of wages and, as we heard, waiting time and also health and safety are very important for self-employed, and they should be taken into account also for broader conventions or documents. So I think what is important about the tool is that, yes, it's a tool, so it's a practical thing, but also it's basically showing you the value of all these usually unpaid costs. And it makes everybody aware that these costs are there, and this is what people should get. So at all levels, so not just for the workers, but for everybody who can have a say or change the situation.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So it's also really about making transparent. So, okay, so what are the
Yeah.
elements that in the end contribute to the hourly rates of a freelancer or a self-employed worker? I think we also forget in many discussions the clients of platforms, because we're looking to platforms, but in the end, the clients also need to take a responsibility. I think in the more general platform debate, also in media, the clients are forgotten about responsibility. Let's say advertisers paying social media platforms lots of money. So thanks for your contribution. I think it's a really interesting exploration where I'm also part of this journey. I think it's really fascinating to see, and also the discussion about 43% of the global workforce is self-employed, and there are no broad accepted pay floors for these workers. So I think it's really important that we also should care about this really broad big category of workers. So thank you very much, Daniela.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you. And also a nice bridge to the next speaker. So then the last rounds about how to implement a living pay, because it's nice to be aware of it. It's nice to have a number, but in the end, how do you also bring it into practice? There was already a small bridge by Daniela about also the conversations and also the transparency that this also brings. But I think also a really nice case is from Milan van Boldrik. She is also one of our speakers. So Milan, welcome to the online webinar.
Thank you, Martijn.
And so Milan has worked as an advocate for the Dutch Association of Journalists, the NVA. I'm also Dutch, as you then probably can hear, for almost 8 years now, campaigning for fair and transparent working conditions for freelance journalists. And with the NVA, Milan, you managed to have a legally enforceable minimum tariff for self-employed journalists.
Yes.
Can you tell me about the process that led to this, and also some lessons you learned in that?
Yes, definitely. Let me start to say that we're the Union of Journalists, and half of our members are freelancers. So that means that for a long time, we already have been campaigning for the rights of freelancers. So in that sense, we're maybe a different union, because we welcome the freelancer and their rights for a very long time, and it's definitely part of our system of campaigning. And Paulien also, I think, said at the beginning, never give up. And I think in this discussion, that is good to remember that, because for us, the road to a good tariff, like a forcible tariff, was a road of solidarity, to organize the employees and the freelance workers together and get them on a sort of campaign that the employees with the protected rights campaign for the freelancers, because in journalism they work quite closely together, but they have very different rights, basically. And so it was our mission to actually bring the workforce together and make together the demands for a tariff. So what happened a couple of years ago is that when we were bargaining a collective agreement, we wouldn't sign this agreement unless we had a good tariff for the freelancers as well. And we couldn't do that without the workforce willing to strike, basically. And it didn't come to an absolute strike, but it was the power, that the voices that came from the work floor, that the publishers said, okay, we are willing to negotiate an agreement with you with the tariffs for the freelancers. And I think the building block was actually the force from the work floor, where the employees said, okay, we're the freelancers are our buddies, we're gonna do this together. I mean, and it wasn't an easy road, because we also had to go to court a couple times to just, with the publishers against us, like saying we should do this tariff. And when we went to court, we also made a campaign out of it. And that, I mean, we asked all our members, employees, and freelancers to just join us at the court in the public and just show the support. And I think that for us was one of the biggest lessons, that you can make difficult agreements for freelancers, but you need the support of the workforce, and you need kind of the willingness to put up a fight. So that is the building block for us to be that we were able to make an agreement for freelancers with minimum tariff, and also the agreement that they get the same indexation every year, the minimum indexation, as that we have in the collective agreement for employees.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's really inspiring also this solidarity between all the workers. So not saying, okay, we have the employed and the self-employed, but yeah, we're the journalists, and some of us are employed, some of us are self-employed, but in the end, we stand for our group and together, and we're not happy when only one of us gets a good deal, but we want to have a good or fair, or you can of course discuss the wording, but we all want to have the same deal. I think it's really interesting. And also, how did you also then in the end calculate it, what a minimum is?
Yeah, I think the nice talk of Daniela is also inspiring, and actually we try to do it in the same way, but I think a little bit smaller, because we do it for the publishing workforce, for the journalists. But in the end, we also made a tariff calculator with fair tariffs for the journalist freelancers. And how we did this is that we looked at the payments of the employees, because we do have a collective agreement, and in the collective agreement, all the jobs are basically waged in the right way. So we think that is a good starting point to make the tariffs. And of course, we calculate. It took a lot of calculation to do all the extras that actually Daniela was really explaining very well, like the pension, the disability, your own laptop, for photojournalists, also the car, and all those things we threw in the mix. And to make it really simple, basically we say a freelancer in freelance journalists need to get at least 170% of the wage that an employee get, because that extra 70%, so 170%, is the extra that you need to cover all your extra cost as a freelancer. And then we also took in the mix, because what is a fair tariff? A fair tariff is also a tariff that takes in consideration your experience as a freelancer. So we took the collective agreement as starting point, added all these extra elements that you need to, as a freelancer, to pay, and made basically 3 levels of experience, like the starter, the medium person, and the senior. And this is not the enforced tariff, unfortunately, because that is the really right tariff, but it helps our freelancers to in the negotiation, and to show, like, look, this is what I actually should get. So it's a building block in getting the tariff. But we do have the enforced minimum tariffs, of course, in the agreements that I just talked about.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think really inspiring also the extra advice on the 3 different levels, because in the end, things like working experience. So because also in communication, because how do you make sure that a floor doesn't becomes a ceiling?
Yeah, that is a good question, because of course in journalism there's also a group of journalists that are very well paid, and thank God that also exists. But a whole group is more more vulnerable. And basically, a minimum tariff is, of course, something you do for the vulnerable and not for the really successful journalists that have a big name. And we did have quite a lot of discussion with our members on all different levels. And in the end, we did, in discussion and in explaining, we did manage to agree with all of our members that basically a floor would help the most vulnerable not to go below a living wage, and that the stronger journalists can actually have a better bargain position, so they can go higher than the floor. So in the end, it was basically human discussion like we are doing now, and explaining to each other how this works, and that you need to protect the ones that are not don't have big names or are at a starting point.
Yeah, perfect. And I think also really being really consistent in your in the wording you use to also prevent the misunderstanding of between floor and ceiling, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And basically, what also helped is that the minimum tariff was first set by the publishers, and now the minimum tariff is set by us, by the Union of Journalists. So that also helped, because the minimum, so the tariff that a lot of journalists started on was way lower than the minimum tariff that we managed to get with the organizing and the court cases.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So Milan, thank you very much for your inspiring contribution. There are some questions in the chat, so maybe you can also answer them there. So thanks very much. And yeah, I think a really inspiring example on how you can really make numbers into impact, which is really nice, and it also really comes together. So thank you very much for
You're so
that.
welcome.
And then we go to our next speaker, Tianling Yang. So you're a doctoral researcher in the research group Data Algorithmic Systems and Ethics at the Weizmann Institute at the Technische Universität in Berlin. And your research focused on social and institutional context of the production of machine learning data sets, as well as actors and stakeholders in the global AI supply chains. You're also the author of the discussion paper Ethical Data Work and Research, where you and your co-founders share recommendations to ensure fair wages and prevent exploitation of data workers. So Tianling, welcome here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And can you also give a bit of short background on your discussion paper? So why was it needed, and especially also the more focusing on the pay part,
Yep. And so for the background, our focus is on data work. So the human labor needed to collect, annotate, clean data, and to verify automated outputs. And this kind of work is commonly outsourced to the global south, for example, through platforms such as Amazon Mechanical Turk and remote tasks, and also business process outsourcing companies. And we see that as more and more AI-based systems are developed and applied, this kind of work is also increasingly in demand. And there are increasing research and news reports on the precarious working conditions for data workers in the industry settings. But we also find that there's a lack of ethical codes and guidelines for the use of this kind of service in the academic research. So we thought that we wanted to learn more about workers' experiences, challenges, and needs, but also to develop a set of principles, but also good practices for the academic requesters, and aim to have these incorporated into scientific ethical codes.
Okay, so thanks for that. And so what are the unpaid labor or wage theft elements that you got to know when interviewing and working with self-employed data workers that work via platforms?
I think a lot has been said already about the unpaid labor, such as waiting time and searching for tasks, etc. And maybe in the data work context, what is more specific would be workers are often required to do pre-tests, to go through trainings unpaid, and also to communicate with clients and ask for clarification, rework on tasks in iterations. All these time and efforts are not paid. And also, like after completing the task, workers might not get the full payment, or sometimes like even no payment at all. Massive rejection is really a problem in the data work industry. For example, from a report from Data Workers Inquiry Project, Yasser mentions that his work was like approved by 2 supervisors who checked his quality and then said like, okay, it's good to go. But then the clients rejected all the work and he was not paid. And also clients might also reject part of the work so that they can reduce the overall payment. And importantly, even the work is rejected, the clients will still keep all the data. And another issue would be like the wage loss workers have due to payment methods. For example, the issue with gift card. Like in the report from Alex, also from Data Workers Inquiry Project, he mentioned that Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, their payment are deposited into their Amazon.com gift card balance rather than being paid directly. So workers actually have to find ways to transform their earnings into really usable monies, and they can lose part of the earnings in this process. Like some would buy products and then sell them in the local market, and then they bear the expenses about value-added tax, shipping costs, import fees, etc. Some also might buy physical or digital goods and then sell them at a discount in exchange for cryptocurrencies, and then later exchange for their preferred currencies. So all this process will incur like wage loss in this process.
Yeah, so also what you also say is that in the end, so it's nice to have a number for a living tariff, but in the end there are much more other different variables where you also need to take into account, which you also describe in the report, which you also share in the chat, which is also really occupational or sectoral specific, which also highlights the need to really also focus on that. And also this awareness issue of which you also address within the paper, is it a awareness issue or is it also maybe a business model issue?
Yeah, I think that's like a really important question. I think there is an awareness issue. There's an issue with the business model that platforms operate, but also an issue with the global AI value chain. So I will try to explain my thoughts. I feel like the awareness issue is important because clients might not be aware of the working conditions because this work has been made invisible in the AI supply chains. And then there are growing research and also reports on this to raise this public awareness. But even the clients become more aware of these conditions, I think there might also be an open question regarding whether they're willing to take active steps to address these problems. Like being aware of these conditions and workers' positions and also attending to all these contexts will require time, effort, and also money. For example, if clients might need to increase their budget if they underestimated the time needed to complete tasks, or like they need additional work to enhance the quality. Or clients may need to take time to find out relevant living wage standards and the pay policies of the platforms involved. So like these are all the additional work that clients need to take if they want to be ethical. But also, like you rightly point out, I think it's also related to how the platforms operate, because like some of the problems are often obscured by the platforms, because the platforms benefit from keeping like these working conditions and the actual pay workers receive hidden. And this allows them to minimize workers' pay, but also to maximize their profit margins. But at the same time, I also feel like maybe thinking about this as a business model could risk like naturalizing this like as a market outcome. Also, it can make people kind of blame the platforms instead of thinking about what roles the clients can pay. I think in the data work context, the low pay is also about the extraction of labor and value in the global AI value chain. For example, making this work and the human labor required hidden can help present the final products as very autonomous, and therefore, like the clients would have this commercial benefits from doing that.
Yeah, but I think also a really important part of your message also educates the stakeholders that they're also aware of different variables and costs that apply on maybe a business or a culture or continent where they don't have so much knowledge about that. So thanks, Daniela, for your contribution. I'm going to take 5 minutes extra of your time because we have one last spontaneous speakers which are Fantas Kanyugi and Joanne Kenyua from the Data Labor Association, which is also, I think, a really nice bridge of the work of Tina Ling. Fantas, welcome here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you having me. Yeah.
Yeah, you have experience as a data worker yourself, but you're also the vice president of the Data Labor Association, and where I also, as a bridge to the story of Tina Ling, also want to make that you also now busy with a code of conduct. So in the questions on, okay, how can you also make impact with those numbers? You're working also on a code of conduct. For platforms, BPOs, and clients, pay is also part of this. Can you also define or explain how you define fair pay for self-employed data workers working via platform in this code of conduct?
Yeah, I think a huge consideration that should be done for workers is the fact that yes. Yeah. So it's the fact that there are incurred costs for workers whenever they, are working on the platform. For example, they need to have internet, for example. They need to have a working laptop or maybe a desktop that they use. They need to have a working desk. So it's all very inclusive. It's not just zero sum. I think the biggest issue is that a lot of platforms actually use the minimum wage to kind of determine how much to give for workers. So what we find is that usually a worker, for example, uh, could you just sorry to interrupt this, but there's a bit of an issue. Let me just sort it in a few seconds and get.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Then I will go to for the last question for Susanna, and then hope that Evandas will come back. Susanna, so let's see. Yes, there you are. Sorry, I was looking in my screen with all the different text. So also maybe to conclude, and then we go back to Evantas if he's still available. So what role do you think ITUC can play or is playing in raising more awareness of the need of pay for self-employed gig workers? And does the fact that gig work is operating mainly in already precarious to consumer markets also maybe then requires another approach? Your microphone is still on mute.
Yeah, let me focus on this dichotomy between the protection of consumers, or maybe poor consumers, and protection of workers. So protection of consumers against high prices, because I think this is what we mean here. So both have as the objective to curb the dominant power, right, on the market or in the labor relationship. But if we want to protect, to achieve low prices on the market, sort of an expense of low payments to platform workers, do we achieve this goal of curbing the dominant power? It's only us humans who actually play both roles, right? So as workers, and consumers. And I would answer this, I think we need to look at the role that the wage policy, for instance, adopting minimum wage or pay play. It's beyond individual. It's not only protecting a weak party of the labor contract or whatever contract we sign, it's also collective. So we want to reduce inequality, but it's also sort of a governance role, in the sense that wage policy is a major tool for distribution of wealth. So if we look at the ILO Constitution from 1919, the ILO Constitution requires member states to adopt wage policies to ensure just share of fruits of progress. So maybe we want to have wage policies protecting platform workers that would ensure fair share of fruits of digitalization or globalization or whatever we call it. And my closing remark would be, yes, we have precarious to consumers markets on which someone's are making multi-billion-dollar businesses. So, what is, I think this is basically gives us maybe a little bit militant direction of action.
Yes, and what role do you think a methodology like Living Tariff can also play in this discussion?
So I think that like pushing for a certain regulation, whatever the regulation should be, through the law, through collective agreements, through negotiations, to have a minimum, at least minimum protection. This is the right protection of pay rates, right, of platform workers. It's indeed like the direction that we should take, because in the end, if we pay platform workers better, they will also be more independent consumers. So it's like really it's this it's for me it's a false dichotomy, consumers against workers. It should be humans in the roles of consumers and workers against real big players who make money.
Yeah, I agree in that, and I think then the living tariff can also be a evidence-based calculation in these discussions on then what should the rate then in the end be?
Well, I think it's crucial.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Susanna, and for the last 2 minutes back to Evantis. You're back online. Welcome back. You just shared some information about the code of conduct. What strategies do you also have to make impact with the code of conduct, also on the pay level?
First, sorry, apologies. I'm in my vehicle and was asked to move it because of a truck that was passing by. That was the interruption. But to your question, the strategies that can make an impact with the code of conduct, for example, one, when working on the first to explain it is, the code of conduct is we took up all the major challenges. We did a research with workers and we tried to do, after doing the research, we kind of looked at which were the biggest silos of challenges that people are facing. And the biggest one we found was the fair pay, for example. But then we do understand that, for example, when you talk about pay, the reason that the tech companies are actually coming to the global south is because they're actually looking for cheap labor. But then when they define cheap labor, for example, in Kenya, and they say that it's $1 per hour, the minimum wage that they've used to indicate this is, for example, not to belittle that profession, but is the watchman, the amount that they get paid. We're talking about a house manager. But then for them, they don't really have any sort of expense tied to the work that they do. And what that means is that they're facilitated with the resources to be able to do the work that they're supposed to do. So if it is a house manager, for example, they're given accommodation, they're given the tools for cleaning, um, they are given, for example, the detergents, for example, that they need. If it's a watchman, they just show up. Maybe all you need is, maybe a firearm that was provided by the hiring company. But then now when it comes to data workers, you find that there are costs that are attached to whatever you're doing. So for example, for most projects, you'll find that they have specifications for the internet that you need. Usually it's very high end. There's also a machine, a laptop that they have requirements. It might even cost you up to thousands of dollars. And then you also need to have internet, you need to have your own electricity. So these things are not put into consideration when, for example, they say the minimum wage in Kenya should be $1, which is equated to the pay of a watchman or a housekeeper, whereas the work that we do is actually tied to costs. And so when we did the code of conduct, for us, we were trying to figure out, like, can we come up with standards that will be equitable to an employer, but then also be fair to our worker. And it's why we came up with the code of conduct, and we actually did the research with you guys, the wage indicator, where we are looking at what would still qualify as cheap labor. What would still qualify as cheap labor for the employer, but then be equitable pay for the worker. And that's why, for example, we saw that if they are paying people maybe in the US at $20 per hour, if you give us around $3 to $5 per hour, then it still counts as cheap labor, but then it is still very fair pay for the workers. And so the strategies that we are putting in place to make sure that it has an impact is one, we actually co-created it with platforms where we were actually considering them, asking them for inquiries. So the final draft has taken a bit of time. We're actually engaging with clients to figure out like what what is equitable for them? Do they feel like these things are okay? We also did the same with BPOs, and then we also engaged a lot of workers. And then we also, set clear measurable standards where we're talking about the minimum pay floor. We're talking about transparency, where, for example, a lot of platforms, you don't know how much you'll get paid for a task before you do it. You're just surprised with pay afterwards. And then we also try to connect the code of conduct to ethical procurement so that clients choose compliant vendors. So it's like if someone is compliant with the code of conduct, then that is someone who's following the right way and is providing equitable pay for workers. Another thing we're trying to do is to enable worker-led monitoring and safe reporting channels for violation. Because what we've noticed is that for a lot of workers, you find that as they are trying to voice, objections against, say, poor pay and things of that nature, you find that there's a lot of victimization. Someone is, for example, graded poorly. Somehow for years, someone has been performing well, but then the moment they speak up, they are graded poorly and then their contract is terminated. So trying to find ways of, worker-led monitoring. And then also publishing public scorecard or ranking to create reputational pressure, and then build alliances with other unions, feminist labor groups, and academia for legitimacy. Yeah, and then finally to run a pilot implementation with willing partners to show that a real-world scenario or adoption of the code of conduct is something that can actually work. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Evans, thank you very much for sharing this. And I think it's what you also summarized. It's about information, but also about awareness. Maybe sometimes pushing a bit, like with the ratings, which also practically works always really well. And also within the to business environment, also about procurement, about it's also companies being available or responsible for their value chain or their supply chain for that. So thank you very much, Evantus. We're a bit running out of time, so I'm going to close the webinar. So thank you very much all speakers for your attendance. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think we could talk for hours, and we will do another moment. Also, thanks for all the guests for your attendance, and also please also feel free to continue the discussion, because I think what's most important is that we just keep the conversation going, inform, create awareness, and in the end, also be patient, because we all know change takes some time, but we also need to find ways to stay optimistic. And I think we also saw today enough nice cases that's really contribute to being optimistic. So thank you very much, everybody. We will email you with a event report on this, and we're going to organize a new webinar in March, where we will also contact for you for. But for now, I wish you all a very good day. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.